In the year 1500, Rome stood at a crossroads of glory and decay. Ancient ruins loomed over ruthless power struggles, divine ambition mixed with corruption, and the rebirth of art unfolded in the shadow of fear. This was the Eternal City at its most dangerous moment. By the year 1500, Rome was a city living under the weight of its own history. Ancient temples, shattered forums, and broken aqueducts still dominated the landscape, not as symbols of power but as reminders of what had been. Lost. Marble from imperial monuments was routinely stripped and reused for churches and palaces. Pilgrims arrived in vast numbers, drawn by the tombs of apostles and martyrs, walking past ruins of emperors who once ruled the known world. The idea of Rome as the eternal city endured, but daily life told a harsher story. Much of the population lived in poverty, infrastructure was decaying, and outbreaks of disease were common. Political instability and lawlessness shaped everyday existence. Romans moved through streets crowded with relics of empire, carrying the psychological burden of inhabiting a city forever compared to its own unreachable past. At the turn of the 16th century, Rome was being deliberately reshaped through the ideals of the Renaissance. Popes and elites promoted art, architecture, and classical learning as proof that Rome was rising again after centuries of decline. Ancient statues were excavated and studied, Latin texts revived, and new buildings designed to echo imperial grandeur. Yet this rebirth was carefully curated. While palaces and churches expanded, much of the city remained neglected, and inequality deepened. Humanist scholars praised Rome as the center of Western civilization, but the revival served political legitimacy as much as cultural progress. The Renaissance in Rome was not a spontaneous awakening of the population, but a top-down project, financed by church wealth and driven by the desire to reclaim authority, prestige, and control in a city still struggling beneath the surface. In 1500, real power in Rome rested with the papacy, but the popes of this era ruled less like spiritual leaders and more like secular princes. Figures such as Pope Alexander VI governed through diplomacy, military force, and strategic marriages, openly advancing their family's interests. The papal states were defended and expanded through armies and alliances, drawing Rome into the wider conflicts of Italy. Vast sums were spent on construction, art, and warfare, funded by taxes, church offices, and indulgences. This concentration of power transformed the Vatican into one of Europe's most influential courts, but it also fueled corruption and resentment. For many Romans and observers across Christendom, the contrast between the Church's spiritual mission and its political behavior was increasingly impossible to ignore, setting the stage for future upheaval. The transformation of Rome relied heavily on artists whose labor reshaped its physical and symbolic identity. Under papal patronage, figures such as Michelangelo, Donato Bramante, and Raphael were drawn to the city, tasked with projects meant to rival the achievements of antiquity. These commissions promised fame, but they also came with immense pressure, tight deadlines, and financial uncertainty. Payments were often delayed, contracts rewritten, and artistic independence constrained by papal demands. Massive building campaigns, including the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, consumed resources and human effort on an unprecedented scale. Rome's artistic revival was not a romantic age of inspiration alone. It was a system driven by power, competition, and exploitation, where even the greatest talents worked under relentless expectations to serve the city's image. Beneath Rome's grand building projects, daily life for most residents remained harsh and uncertain. By 1500, the city's population had grown rapidly, but infrastructure had not kept pace. Many neighborhoods lacked clean water and effective sanitation, contributing to frequent outbreaks of disease. Crime was common, especially after dark, as weak policing and factional violence made the streets dangerous. Large numbers of laborers, pilgrims, and the urban poor crowded into cramped housing near ancient ruins and unfinished construction sites. While church officials and elites lived in fortified palaces, much of the population survived through irregular work tied to building projects or religious tourism. The contrast was impossible to miss. Marble facades and monumental churches rose above streets filled with poverty and instability. For ordinary Romans, the Renaissance was visible from a distance, but its benefits were uneven. reinforcing social divisions that shaped the city's daily reality. Religion shaped every aspect of life in Rome, but faith in 1500 was inseparable from fear and authority. As the center of the Catholic Church, Rome projected spiritual power across Europe, reinforced through ritual, law, and spectacle. Public processions, relics, and jubilees reminded believers of salvation and judgment, while sermons emphasized sin, punishment, and obedience. Indulgences, promoted as a means to reduce time in purgatory, became a major source of revenue, tying spiritual anxiety directly to money. For many Romans, religion offered meaning and hope, but it also functioned as a system of control. The Church regulated morality, censored ideas, and punished dissent. Faith was genuine and deeply felt, yet it existed within a structure that rewarded conformity and reinforced the authority of those who ruled in God's name. At the dawn of the 16th century, Rome stood exposed to forces beyond its walls. Italy had become the central battleground of Europe, drawn into a series of conflicts, later known as the Italian Wars. French, Spanish, and Holy Roman armies moved across the peninsula, each seeking influence over its wealthy city-states. Rome was both a symbolic prize and a strategic target. Popes shifted alliances constantly, balancing diplomacy with military force to protect the papal states. Mercenary troops were hired, fortifications expanded, and taxes raised to fund defense. Yet instability followed. The presence of foreign powers undermined Rome's autonomy and exposed its vulnerabilities. Behind the city's renewed grandeur, anxiety grew. Political survival depended not on divine protection alone, but on navigating an increasingly violent European power struggle that would soon bring devastating consequences to the Eternal City. Despite mounting pressures, Rome continued to project an image of permanence and authority. Centuries of survival had fostered a belief that the city, protected by history and faith, would always endure. Monumental construction reinforced this confidence, as new churches and palaces rose directly atop ancient foundations. Yet signs of fragility were increasingly visible. Financial strain from warfare, dependence on mercenary armies, and resentment toward papal corruption weakened Rome from within. The conviction that the city was untouchable dulled urgency and masked risk. Political leaders focused on appearances of power rather than structural stability. Rome had rebuilt itself many times before, and this history bred complacency. By 1500, the Eternal City stood convinced of its own resilience, unaware that the same forces it believed it had mastered were quietly aligning against it, preparing to test whether eternity was faith or illusion. Looking back, Rome in 1500 reveals a city defined by contradiction rather than certainty. It was a center of artistic achievement and intellectual revival, yet also a place of deep inequality, corruption, and insecurity. The legacy of empire inspired ambition, while the authority of the church sustained power and shaped belief across Europe, but Rome's confidence rested on fragile foundations. Political overreach, moral tension, and reliance on spectacle masked vulnerabilities that history would soon expose. The city's experience demonstrates that cultural brilliance does not guarantee stability, and that symbols of eternity can obscure approaching collapse. Rome believed its past ensured its future, but history would prove otherwise. The lesson of Rome at the dawn of the 16th century is not about decline alone, but about how power, faith, and identity can create illusions of permanence even as the conditions for crisis quietly take shape.